Hello, and welcome to What is Innovation, the podcast that explores the reality of a word that is in danger of losing its meaning altogether. This podcast is produced by Outlast Consulting, LLC, a boutique consultancy that helps companies use innovation principles to solve their toughest business problems. I'm your host, Jared Simmons, and I'm so excited to have Andy Benz. Andy Benz is a co-founder of ChangeLogic, a Boston-based strategic advisory firm. He works with CEOs, boards, and senior teams as they lead significant business change. His goal is to help organizations liberate their potential to excite the world with innovation. Andy has 25 years of consulting experience as both an external and internal consultant for McKinsey & Company, the IBM Corporation, and ChangeLogic. At IBM, Andy was deeply involved in the Emerging Business Opportunity Program, for which he received an award from IBM's vice chairman. Andy, welcome to the show. So excited to get to chat with you.
Thank you for the invitation, Jared. It's great to talk to you and to speak to somebody in the warm weather of Atlanta. Up here in Boston, we need a little bit of encouragement that it'll get warm again one day.
Yeah, hopefully it's headed your way from us. But well, why don't we dive right in? What, in your mind, is innovation?
Innovation is converting an idea into something that is used. So for me, it has to be, it's not invention. Invention is like a really vital antecedent of most of innovation, but it's really about, can you turn something into something that's used? And, you know, if you go on, you could then say, well, that solves a problem and whatever. But I think it is used is the point. That's the test.
Right.
And then obviously, you know, we're in business a lot of the time, then is it used and creates a commercial return or whatever? That's a proxy of use.
Right.
And sometimes I think we get over-focused in business on the commercial return, or certainly we get over-focused on the idea and not enough on does somebody use it? What are they going to use it for? How is it going to get applied? What problem will it solve? That's really the place of obsession, I think, for innovation.
I love that definition. The stopping at the use is something I haven't really heard someone talk about. And I like that a lot because I've heard people talk about taking it all the way through to the consumer, or how it creates value and all those other things. But the element, the actual sort of fundamental element of that, as you said, is it actually being used?
Yeah.
And I guess once you have a user in the broadest sense of the term, then you have space to learn and evolve if necessary, but then you have space to learn.
That's right, because somebody is using you, finding out what they're doing with it. You can then build and iterate around it based on what you see happening. And of course, you know, innovation nowadays is as much to do with that element of surprise of what happens in a crowd, right? What happens in a platform and so on. So yeah, that's also a key part of it. Yeah,
I like that a lot. I think it also opens the definition of innovation up to services in a way that is often kind of closed off.
Yeah. In our book, Corporate Explorer, we talk about the role of what people talk about as the MVP, finding out if your innovation is useful to somebody. And we actually call it MVO, a minimum viable offering, because services is just as relevant. And indeed, one of the case studies in the book is from management consulting. Management consulting is innovating, which is quite a rarity in many ways.
Yeah.
And there, you know, you have to but even with a product, there's more than just the physical product to the value, right? So I think getting into thinking about how we're using things, what's the offering we're being made, then how's it being, you know, consumed or adopted by the user is the kind of language that we try to use.
I can imagine a lot of people who are creating, the idea creators, the service creators, have a lens on what innovation is or what would make something innovative. I like your definition because it implicitly puts the user in the driver's seat in terms of defining what is innovation. So what do you think about that? And then have you seen that kind of make a difference in how people approach innovation?
Yeah, I think it's not non-controversial.
Sure.
So actually, I'll use two examples. One of them is from Atlanta, is the Atlanta Opera Company. And I have the tremendous, if given my accent and my location, unlikely pleasure of being on the advisory council of the Atlanta Opera.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Next time I'm down there, I'll take you to a performance.
That'd be great.
And you have an outstanding general manager, one of the most innovative leaders in opera in the world, Thomas Vullin. You should have him on your show. He's just totally outstanding. Yeah. And so we've helped Toma and team when they were facing how do they sustain performances during the COVID lockdown. And they created this big tent series. And if you heard about this, they put it in a baseball field in a college in Atlanta.
Oh, right.
And they opera differently. They did a whole bunch of different, they introduced doing it with movies and all kinds.
Unbelievable.
But part of the thing that still, even as Toma innovated and certainly made his concept of opera useful to people that otherwise was just in his head,
right.
For him, this is still a creative vision. And he's not very interested in, I love the man, Stanley, if he's listening. It's not about a user-generated creative vision.
Right.
It is creative. But then the second example I'd go, we work for a large Japanese firm, and they are fabulous technical innovators. And for them, the question of innovation is about the question of technical breakthrough. And then, yes, we will investigate the potential applications for our innovation.
Right.
And so I understand that this is a kind of completely different mentality or set of assumptions. And they're brilliant, and I get them, and they've clearly worked. It's not as if nobody has ever had a technical vision or a creative vision that didn't have a good, focus group result or something, right?
Right.
But I think we no longer have time for that thinking in our modern world.
Mm-hmm.
I can't justify that, and therefore I can't put it in my definition of innovation. For me, I have to be curious about how it's going to get used, because that is actually what will drive me to be more successful. And, in Corporate Explorer, we tell a couple of stories of where firms fall into the solution trap, where they get so wrapped up in their own definition of creating value that they really struggle to realize that the users have got a big objection. Their big objection is, we don't need it. And so the reality is that non-consumption of an innovation is often the most likely response. And we don't even have that. It's going to be against a competitor, or they'll like this. It's actually, no, I don't want it at all.
Right.
And a lot of innovations actually land that place for a bunch of and it's usually because we haven't really thought through how it's used. There's another dimension to this question of use, which is adoption and adoption chains.
Yes.
I don't know if you've read the work of Ron Adner from Tuck Business School. Ron's work is underappreciated, in my view.
Yeah.
Because in very simple terms, what Ron says is that any product is necessarily a sequence of points of adoption. You might create a product, but it's got to get through distribution, it's got to get sold, it's got to get the home environment in which it's used. He gives this very vivid example of Pfizer and inhalable insulin. And so brilliant innovation.
Yeah.
Being able to deliver insulin in such a convenient to carry and consume form. Amazing.
Yeah.
Right. And it gets FDA approval on one condition. And the condition is that you have a breath test to make sure that you have the appropriate lung capacity to absorb the compound into your bloodstream. And so they go to the doctors they've been working with, the endocrinologists, and oh, yes, we've all got that equipment. That's fine. And of course, the problem is that diabetes patients don't see endocrinologists every day. They see general practitioners, right?
Yeah.
Who don't have that. And therefore, they can't get the thing prescribed. And so it falls.
That's the barrier.
That's the barrier. And
Wow.
you can go to here's another example of digital movie projectors that are there for 10 years, but there's no incentive for movie theaters to adopt them. And eventually they have to be given a whole finance scheme to be able to have a reason to adopt them.
Right.
So the point is, this use question turns out to be a dimension of innovation that we often ignore. Right? So I think that's another reason for including it in our definition.
Yeah, I think there's just so much to unpack there. My brain is just pinging with questions and thoughts, but the element of tying use in your definition to this sequence of adoption choice, because to me it takes it back to choices.
Yes.
And at every point in that series of adoptions, this person is either choosing to continue down the path or not. And so in that choice is an unconscious value equation. And at every point when they choose to adopt, you've demonstrated that the value of their idea of what you're offering is greater than the value of non-use.
Of non-use or whatever they're doing.
Yeah.
And Ron describes this as essentially a risk equation, exactly as you frame it. Yeah.
I like the risk equation versus value kind of definition, in that, especially in the last couple of years, we have become more value resistant and risk averse. So I think companies, industries, and people have become more cognizant in their value equation of the potential downside than the potential upside.
Right.
And I think the coefficients on those have changed.
Right.
In terms of...
Because of the pandemic, you mean?
Because of the pandemic and because of the economic fallout of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And because of the macroeconomic swirl that has come from the pandemic. So there's the sort of medical aspect of it, but then also how it has sort of dominoed into all the other aspects of how you would choose peanut butter or facial tissues.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the math that consumer goods companies, and I'll just speak for that because that's the area we work in.
Yeah.
A lot of the math consumer goods companies have done in terms of, okay, this is our pricing model. This is the number of SKUs we need to have in this set. This is how we approach this category. A lot of that has been fundamentally altered, and temporary adjustments are not a sustainable solution. And I think that's where that definition, having use in that definition, is also useful in terms of being able to reevaluate what you already have. So is it still useful? And is it still useful in the same way?
Yeah, exactly. Our book, Corporate Explorer, one of the things that we're doing, I think, is trying to say, firstly, the book is about how do corporations lead innovation and disruptive innovation?
Yes.
Most particularly. And well, firstly, we give examples of where that's happened and happening.
Yeah.
But without minimizing the difficulties, right? You know, it's kind of, for many, this is like an oxymoron.
Right.
My dad was in the RAF, and he always used to say that military intelligence was an oxymoron. So for many, corporate innovation is the same.
Yeah, yeah.
But in reality, it does happen, and there are some great successful examples. And we wrote the book to try to inspire more, because we believe that corporations have assets, have potential, have people that can do this and who are kind of locked up by a system that doesn't always permit it. And if you like, the one place where I think corporations can advance their practice is if they get used to this notion of de-risking, of learning, of testing, and testing about the usage, learning about the problems that customers have, are the kinds of things that can come through this kind of level of uncertainty that you're describing, and making that a more embedded practice and human practice as well. Yeah, there are processes, but you know, it's a human system that really stops it,
right?
Not the process in that sense.
So true, so true. And I wonder if, as I think about what you're describing, I'm wondering about the difference between, because I'm thinking about innovation processes and how they've been, you know, sort of defined, structured, and implemented in corporate environments. And that's been, you know, a lot of my career. You used to hear the word risk a lot. What you didn't hear a lot was resilience. And I feel like, you know, when you're talking about it, I hear a lot of the elements of what I consider resilience, which I think is going to have to replace risk as a fundamental element of innovation going forward, because we now know that we know so little about what we thought we knew. You know what I mean?
Right. The risk is premised on the notion that you can eliminate it.
Exactly.
Right. Intriguing. I like that. That's intriguing. Yeah. And so resilience is you just keep on learning until it strikes.
Exactly. And without the sort of expert bias of being able to say, you know, I can know where all the risks are.
Yeah.
And I can productively react and respond to those.
Yes.
We've just been taught now
very
clearly that has always been a fallacy.
Yes.
And there's probably different muscles that you want to focus on building, understanding that you cannot de-risk a product or a process or an industry or a technology to a level that would allow you to only focus on risk.
Where were you when I was writing chapter 8 of Corporate Explorer? That's a brilliant idea. I would have pinched happily, because we talk in the book about, you know, we talk about it as the silent killers of exploration.
Oh, that's great.
The phrase silent killers, I should say, I borrowed from one of my colleagues, Harvard, Mike Beer, wrote an article using that phrase like 20 years ago. But the silent killers of exploration are, firstly, it's about the focus on the short term. It's that lack of patience, that lack of ability to think beyond not just a quarter. And I think that the notion that this is all a public company problem is a little bit weak, because I work with plenty of private companies. It's the same problem.
Yeah.
It's a human challenge, right?
Agreed.
Another of the silent killers is then risk aversion. is this difficulty we have. Human beings love the new. We love to go towards the new, to find things that are exciting and possible. But unfortunately, the closer we get to having to commit to them, that puts at risk things we already have, and then we no longer want them anymore.
Right.
And that's what risk aversion is about, right? It's that pulling away just at the moment when it gets serious, which is why you asked me before the call about, what is innovation, but what is not innovation, right? And I'll answer that one here, because innovation is not about ideas and creativity, precisely for this reason, that we get so obsessed about the possibilities. Ideation is like a drug.
It is.
It's so compelling. It's so exciting. And the trouble is that it's also without any risk. It's without any consequences, without anything that you have to put on the table to do. It can be all just for fun and excitement.
Right.
And if innovation is about something that is used, well, then no, for me, that's not the issue. Now, of course, you need ideas and creativity helps.
Of course.
But let's not mix it up with being the same as innovation.
Right. Nobody calls flour a cake, right?
Right.
Everybody knows the difference between flour and a cake.
Yeah.
But people call ideas innovation, and it's probably more analogous to, an ingredient of innovation than innovation itself.
Yeah. Good. I could have used that in chapter 4. That's so many ideas. Okay. I'll have to do a second edition now.
Yeah. I'm happy to provide whatever other thoughts I can. Yeah. Maybe I can make a couple more chapters, make it into a couple more chapters. Well, the name of the podcast is What is Innovation?
Yeah.
My favorite question is what isn't? Because I think that's where we really start to differentiate as thought leaders and as people who really spend time in the space.
Yeah.
That's where the nuances come in, because it's born of experience.
Yes.
And it's born of either watching clients fail or failing yourself in a way that tells you, okay, well, this is something that people define as innovative, but it doesn't really rise to the highest and best sort of definition of it, because you can do these things and still not, at the end of the day, end up with an innovation.
End up with the outcome. Yeah. And the book Corporate Explorer is the product of 20 or so years work that I've done with my two co-authors, Mike Tushman from Harvard Business School, Charles O'Reilly from Stanford. And I've had the great privilege of working with them this whole time. And so
wonderful.
I wrote it. So just imagine this, I'm writing this book, first time I've ever written a book.
Yeah.
And the people who are giving me a grade are a Harvard and a Stanford professor. So it was like no pressure, right? But they were tremendously supportive. But it represents that long experience that we've had.
Mm-hmm.
And what we find is that when we are asked who get interested in this area of research that we have, which is how do you as a corporation manage a core business and explore into new areas? How can you do both simultaneously?
Yeah.
And so that's the sort of key area of work that we're focused on. And the thing is, when we walk into these companies, we see two classic errors time and again. There are a few others, but the two ones that really, actually I'm going to add a third because it just turned up the other day. The first one is that they are just obsessed with ideas. They have lots of ideas out there. Well,
yes,
we thought innovation is so important that we needed to ask the whole company to come forward with what businesses they would set up.
Mm-hmm.
And they create an innovation zoo, right? And depending on the company is the amount of money that gets spent. And sometimes these are like multi-million a year ventures that still don't have a clear idea of how what they're creating is going to get used to do.
Right.
So the innovation zoo is one. The second one is a little bit kind of reverse almost, which is that somewhere along the line, somebody gets impatient and they just spend and they invest ahead of learning.
Oh, yes.
And
yes.
In Corporate Explorer, we tell the story of GE Digital, which I think is exactly this. They got so excited about what they saw as the opportunity to put sensors onto industrial machines and capture data and run algorithms which would predict when the machines are going to fail, that they didn't really go and investigate, well, what's the point of market maturity?
Right.
Do people use this? Do they have the adoption chain to use it? Is it ready? And they spend all of this money, and after 7 or 8 years, the whole thing crashes and it melts out the door.
Oh my goodness.
Because they spend well ahead of what they really know. And interestingly, that then creates this feedback loop of where nobody else will try for a decade.
Right. It poisons the well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the third one, though, which I haven't seen for a couple of years, but I saw again last week, is the let's go spend $1 billion on a startup. This poor guy was telling me a story the other day. I won't say the company. They spent $1 billion, and it turns out that they have none of the legal conditions or regulatory conditions which would lead the customers to be able to purchase the product. They don't have an identified use case, but the company projections are off the chart.
Of course, yeah.
And you're like, oh. And so those three, and it's all about put more system around it and trust that you have the people. Because we call the book Corporate Explorer, because our contention is that companies have the same ability to release the spirit of innovation in individuals, or the exploratory spirit, as individuals do out on their own in startups.
Right.
And actually, you've got more assets to do it with.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's well said on a number of levels. And that point you just made at the end there sparks a whole kind of soapbox for me around the entrepreneur being the highest form of innovator, which to me is just having done both.
Right.
Started a company and worked in an innovation department within large companies. There is no cap on the ability of corporate teams to innovate.
Yeah.
No natural cap on it.
Yeah.
Now, to me, it's more about eliminating the barriers to that.
Yes.
And so when you take it from a humanistic approach, as you have, the corporate explorer is every bit as innovative and every bit as creative and every bit as resourceful and capable of driving every bit as much value as a freestanding entrepreneur. I mean, people forget that things like Gmail were basically internal corporate innovations.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the $1 billion brands, Pampers is a $10 billion plus. I'm sure it was $10 billion when I worked on it.
Yeah.
Those kinds of businesses started with an idea, started from the mind of an innovator.
That's right.
And, there aren't a lot of $10 billion startups.
No.
So I think that to me was just kind of unlocked by what you said. So I'm going to climb down off my soapbox.
I'll join you. I'll get, if there's room.
There's plenty.
Right. The thing that I think is that they're hiding in plain sight.
Mm-hmm.
You don't make headlines for a big company innovates again.
Right.
And so with this myth that there's something wrong is never fully punctured. One of the examples we have in the book is Microsoft. If you think about what Microsoft did with 365, right?
Yes.
Moving online Exchange server, this completely opened up this whole new area of innovation for them. And as your mention of Gmail, and they took what could have been Google's.
Yep.
And they did that in a very deliberate way. There was a corporate explorer, Rajesh Shah, who led that whole thing, working for this great innovator, Shilu. And they built that business from within Microsoft, a fabulous thing to do. And actually also breaking this notion that you can't cannibalize your existing business.
Right.
They figured out how to do that, right? They figured out how to make sure that their ecosystem remained engaged and remained incentive to help them.
Right.
We tell the story of LexisNexis, which was a relatively sleepy legal information company. And there in Atlanta, Georgia, it created the Risk Solutions business, now a multi-billion-dollar entity created directly out of the LexisNexis business, right? So there are so many examples that are right there hiding in plain sight. And they should give encouragement both to executives, but also to those corporate explorers. Because one of the other things we observe is that very rarely do the corporate explorers get given responsibility to do this. Hey, Jared, go set up $1 billion business for me.
Right.
It happens, but mostly it's Jared saying, hey, Andy, I've got this great idea and you need to give me a little bit of funding to prove it. And I'll go, no, get on with your day job. And then you'll keep at me and you'll keep bringing data, you'll keep bringing perspective. And it happens, right?
Right.
My favorite story, we open the book with this, is Christian Kurtis in Hungary. He's a manager in the European insurance company, Unica. And he fights his way up to the board and says, hey, board, this big insurance bureaucracy that you operate today, I can do the same with just 2 people.
Wow.
How about funding me with just 2 people? Do you want to do that? And he gets them so wound up that this could be true, that they do fund him because they're fearful that if it is true, they won't know anything about their own future.
Right.
And so this business becomes Share Risk, which is a digital insurance line now rolling out across Europe, right? So you can do it from inside up to the top of the business. And yes, it's hard. Not all the CEOs are as enlightened as that CEO, right. But it is possible. That's the point.
That is a great point and very hopeful and inspiring examples that don't get the exposure to the light of day that they should.
Yeah.
And I think that's what perpetuates the myth.
Yeah.
People who are innovative and they run into these sort of brick walls internally. I've got this idea. I can do this with two people. No, 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 no. Pushing through that to get to that last yes. At some point, it kind of comes back to the adoption conversation.
Mm.
At some point, the value of pushing forward to that next decision maker, the sort of risk, associated with that feels greater than, oh, I'm just going to find someone. I'm going to go to an incubator and I'm going to give away half my company and I'm going to, all that stuff.
Yeah.
So do you talk about that at all in the book?
Yeah, totally. I mean, we just did a little bit of a survey on this actually, where we're trying to get at what are some of the compensation models for corporate explorers.
Yeah.
And one of the questions we ask them is, what's the risk that you have?
Right.
And off the chart, the biggest risk is reputation.
Huh.
And you have to see that the corporate explorer is part of a social network. They live in this social context, and reputation is one of the things that they have at risk when they do this. And for the most part,
fascinating.
Explorers are always unpopular, right?
Right.
Recently, the wreck of Ernst Shackleton's boat was found in the Antarctic, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you actually read Shackleton's story, you're like, what was he thinking? It's like he marches, whatever it was, I can't remember the details, like 120 days across the Antarctic and eventually finds safety. He gets back to London, takes a shower, and then he's back off again directly. There's a craziness to being an explorer and question.
Right.
The point is that in companies, they're a part of a social network and they've got to use that. So how do I find the allies?
Mm-hmm.
Don't get too obsessed with my innovation, my idea. Certainly be focused on its use and what customer problem it's solving and so on. But also think about, okay, who are my allies? Who are the people who are going to really do something to help me with this? And then who are my advocates? Who are those who will at least speak well of what I'm proposing?
Mm-hmm.
And speak up for me at various points. This is important at the beginning for sure, but it's also important as it progresses, because it's very easy for an organization to turn against an innovation based on just a few data.
Yes, so true.
Got to manage that social network around it so that you're part of a movement, not just resting on the quality of your idea.
Yes.
And one of the things that corporate explorers sometimes do wrong is they go hide. They think, well, I won't make too much noise and then I won't attract too much attention. I'll just go over here and work on my stuff and then it'll be brilliant. That's really not the way that the successful ones do it. They actually build support around them so that there are many people who think they did it. Mm-hmm. If you go to LexisNexis, the individual corporate explorer was this guy, Jim Peck. Mm-hmm. But there are dozens of people who made it successful.
Right.
And some of them who think they made it successful, who probably got in the way.
Right.
But they think they made it successful.
Yeah.
And that's a little different to the entrepreneur, where they're often all about them.
Yes. Yeah.
And this is one of those big differences, I think. It takes a lot of personal investment, some humility, which isn't always go with that perseverance and resilience that you describe.
Right.
But it is there and it's possible.
No, that's a great example and a great concept for people to sort of sit with and try to digest. Because if I look back 2, 3, 5 years into my career, entering into a big corporate innovation machine, it's easy to see all the things that fall off the wagon along the way.
Yes.
Oh, that was a great idea. Why didn't they do that? Well, this thing got to market, but they pulled all the cool stuff out of it.
Right.
And it's almost about bringing your business education along at the same pace as your technical education. And when I say technical, I'm a chemical engineer, so I can speak ill of my brethren and sisters in that space. But as engineers, we get a huge head start in terms of our technical knowledge and understanding and the processes and the outputs and what that can do directly. But we don't get the same education coming out of school about what it means for a business or for a company and why other people with different types of technical education, because marketing is a technical education, sales is a technical education, there's expertise there.
Yeah.
Why would people with different types of expertise make different decisions?
Yes.
And understand and taking the time to ask that question and get curious about it, as an engineer, using that curiosity, I think is what allowed me to be able to not get frustrated and sort of walk away and say, well, these people they don't get it. I'm going to go start a company.
Yeah.
So I wonder if there's an element in terms of surviving a corporate innovation environment that requires some sort of breadth of education.
Yes.
Self-education, or if companies can provide that type of education early on in a career to give people that broader view.
Yeah. So that we're more curious about what others do and what value they bring.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I didn't list all of the silent killers. One of the other ones we talk about is actually professional identity.
Yes.
You go to an actuary or an electrical engineer or a chemical engineer, or actually one of the cases we don't tell in our book, Corporate Explorer, we do in my colleague's other book, Lead and Disrupt, is advertising.
Yes.
How does Havas, the French advertising company, respond to their own acquisition of a crowdsourced creative firm, Victors and Spoils?
Mm-hmm.
Well, they I'll make a rude gesture to you, which the listeners won't be able to see, because that's what they have to say to them, right?
Right.
You must be kidding, right? You can't do it that way. Our creative art is sacred.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those beliefs are not conscious.
Right.
Actuaries don't respond to a new way of doing insurance consciously to object. Electrical engineers don't object to being able to add value more through software, which is one of the biggest challenges they face.
Right.
But it's still, unless they're curious in the way you described,
mm-hmm.
that becomes a big source of resistance.
Yeah. It's unlocking the existing curiosity, because engineers, actuaries, advertising folks, they are naturally curious.
Yeah.
But that curiosity has been sort of channeled in a certain
direction. Yeah.
Certain direction. And it's really kind of inviting people to get sort of laterally curious and not just curious in that.
To test some of their assumptions.
Yeah. Yeah.
I started my date this morning at 7:00 with a client team working in China. And I must say, one of the things that made it worthwhile was to hear them talking about challenging one of their most fundamental assumptions. I can't say the industry.
Yeah, of course.
And they were saying, well, what if this isn't true? We better go and find some evidence to find out whether we're right about this. I'm like, hallelujah. This got me excited. So it's a good way to start the day.
Yeah, a great way to start the week. That'll get you.
Yeah.
That kind of insight, that kind of client self-directed insight will fuel you for a while.
Yeah, absolutely.
So building on that, Andy, is there any advice you'd have for innovators out there?
So I do think being curious about the problems in the world that you can solve.
Mm-hmm.
And then, when you find one, really commit to it. Innovation is, as I just said, innovation is evidence-led for sure.
Sure.
It's not a science, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot which is instinct as well. And I think this is one of the things that we get from looking at these corporate explorers, is that they have good evidence, they have good instinct, but all of them are curious about something in the world that they see or they experience, and they wonder. The management consulting story we tell is Deloitte and Balaji Bondili at Deloitte. And Balaji participates in the Asia tsunami relief through a crowd-organized activity.
Ah, right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he said, wait, we were really effective at that. What if you did management consulting with more of a crowd source model? Could that work? Would that mean that I don't have to get on the road the whole damn time?
Right. Exactly.
And could do things differently. And so he built this thing, Deloitte Pixel, which partly because of the pandemic has, grown really, really rapidly.
Yeah.
So I think that curiosity, seeing in the world and then sticking with that, because sometimes your resilience, your commitment is what will define whether you can get it done or not. So those would be my two things.
Sage advice. I'm appreciative of you sharing it with me and with our listeners. That's helpful to think about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Andy, it's been a genuine pleasure. And I thank you for making the time to chat. And I can't wait to pick up a copy of Corporate Explorer and especially check out chapters 4 and 8. So.
To know what they could have been.
Yeah. So I really appreciate your time and your insights, and just glad to know other people are out there fighting the good fight in the corporate innovation space. It doesn't get the attention and it doesn't get the support it often deserves. So thank you for your work in that space, because I know what it's like to try to push things forward without this kind of coaching and guidance.
Thank you, Jared. Really fun talking to you. I appreciate it very much. Cheers.
All right. Take care. We'd love to hear your thoughts about this week's show. You can drop us a line on Twitter at Outlast LLC. OUTLAST LLC, or follow us on LinkedIn where we're Outlast Consulting. Until next time, keep innovating, whatever that means.